This is Inspiring Careers with your host, Ingrid Centurion. We're going to talk about fascinating technologies that will impact your future. Meet inspiring entrepreneurs and people that are making huge differences in the community and around the world. We're going to share career and life lessons of inspiration and success. Our mission is to inspire our viewers to make a better life for themselves by sharing our stories, our interviews, and documentaries. Please stay tuned as we have incredible guests coming up. Today we have Peter DiDomenica with us, retired police officer, and after September 11th, he served as a director of security policy at Boston Logan International Airport, where he developed innovative anti-terrorism programs, including creation of a behavior-based screening program adapted by the Transportation Security Administration, known as SPOT, Screening of Passengers by Observation Techniques. SPOT is used at over 160 major airports, and TSA has deployed it all across the nation at commercial airports. He has been a lecturer on terrorism-related issues for the FBI, CIA, Secret Service, DHS, and the Department of Defense Criminal Investigations Task Force. He is also an author of Journey from Genesis to Genocide. Thank you for being on the show with us today.
Thank you for having me.
I'm really interested, and I want you to share your story about September 11th. On that day, where were you? And let's talk about how this led you into the big job that you had at Boston Logan International Airport.
So on September 11th, I was a member of the Massachusetts State Police. I was a sergeant, and I was assigned to headquarters right here, basically across the street from your studio.
Oh.
Working on the staff for the superintendent, who's like the chief of police, John DeFava. And after the 9/11 attacks, well, that day, like specifically, I was in the gym, I was in the locker room, just getting ready for work, and someone came in and said a plane hit the World Trade Center. And then by the time I got to my office, the second plane had hit. And then we realized that this was an organized terrorist attack. And it was shortly after that the governor, Jane Swift, asked my boss, Colonel DeFava, to take over the security at the airport and become not just the head of the state police, but also the director of security for Logan Airport. And there was a team of 3 of us that went over there with Colonel DeFava. And because of my background, being an attorney, I was put in a position of policy or designing programs and assisting in the design of security programs to see how to prevent another 9/11 from happening again.
And so your mission, you told me you were assigned to that mission. How long was your assignment?
I was there for a year and a half, and during that year and a half, basically 12, 14-hour days, 6, 7 days a week.
And who did you report to every week?
My direct boss was Tom Robbins, who eventually became the colonel of the state police, but at that time, he was a captain, and he was the chief of staff for Colonel DeFava. And so Tom and I, and at the time another captain, Scott Perret, were the team. And our mission was to understand how the 9/11 attacks occurred, specifically at Logan Airport, because the 2 planes that flew into the World Trade Center were launched from Logan, and 5 committed terrorists got on each of those planes and walked through security without any prohibited items. Even those box cutters were not prohibited under the actually FAA regulations at the time. And so the question became, what more can we be doing? I mean, if someone could just walk through without anything that's considered illegal and kill thousands of people and hijack a plane, is there something more we could be doing?
So it was so important to you, your mission. You spent 12, 18-hour days, long days, collecting all this data at the airport, which resulted in kind of one of your passions now that you're working on. And you created this SPOT program and these assessments on how to identify people who are violent. You told me you had met the shoe bomber.
Yes.
Share with us that story and what went on there.
So this is a little more than 3 months after the 9/11 attacks, just before Christmas 2001. A gentleman named Richard Reed, he's also been called the shoe bomber, boarded a plane in Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris, bound for Miami. And while it was mid-flight over the Atlantic, he had explosives concealed in his footwear and was attempting to light what was essentially a fuse that was disguised to look like laces. And he was subdued by the passengers and crew before he had a chance to actually ignite the device. And so the plane was diverted to Boston Logan International Airport. That's the biggest airport. And it's the first major airport on that flight path. And so we have all the assets to deal with the situation, like bomb techs, SWAT teams, special operations. And so I happened to be working that day and went out to the airfield with everybody else to basically watch this unfold, because I'm not a tactical person. Like I said, I was there for policy, so I wasn't the one going in the plane. But my boss was, Tom, and the bomb techs and the state police stop team, which is like a SWAT team. They're the ones that neutralized the weapon, made it safe, and brought him out. And at one point, I was probably as close as I am to you to Mr. Reed. And I think I had an epiphany, because the question on my mind was, how did this happen? And what did the people know at that airport about him? And based on what they knew, could they have done more? And then doing the research about what happened, it was obvious that there were so many signs that this person was not a normal passenger. Many people there in security had grave reservations about this person, yet because they couldn't find a device, they felt compelled to let him go through the system. He actually missed the first flight because he was questioned for so long. The airline put him up in a hotel, comes back the next day, same process, gets on the plane, and because they couldn't find a device, they felt this need to allow him through. So the epiphany was that even if we don't find a device, at some point when we have enough information, we should be able to keep people from getting on planes and other critical infrastructure and slow things down and figure out what's going on. And so the way to do that was to start looking at people, not just what's in their bag.
And you did a lot of research. You studied about the Israeli airports. You were telling me about.
There was
as you went into this study to
models,
collecting data.
The best, I think, at that time, and probably still the best at airline security is the Israeli security forces. I mean, but the issue was that they have different constitutional standards. And,
That's right.
And so something like racial profiling, legally they can use race as a factor. We can't do that here. Scalability, they devote a lot more dollars per passenger than we can ever do here. They may have 70 million passengers a year. We have almost 1 billion. And so we don't have the resources to expend that they do in terms of the security. And so
a lot of people don't understand this, though. They think in other parts of the world and in other cities and countries, their population is a lot smaller, so they don't have to expend as many resources.
Right, and they're in an environment where it's almost like a constant state of war, and they're much more prepared and more willing to accept the inconveniences of a high security environment. So you have the cultural factors you had to deal with. Like what are people willing to accept in terms of security and the inconvenience, the cost, and then the constitutional issues about detentions and searches. And so what they were doing, which we wanted to emulate, was the idea of looking at the passenger, and if there was enough objective information that this person was a danger, to not let them in the system. But we had to do it in a way that met our financial resources, our cultural expectations, and our Constitution. And so that became my goal. And so it started with the legal issues, and then into things like psychology, history, anthropology, neuroscience, trying to understand human nature and what makes a person different that knows they're going to die in a matter of minutes or hours, a violent death, and kill hundreds or maybe thousands of people. Is there something different about that person? And everybody I ask just intuitively says yes. and they're right. There is something different.
You watch a lot of people. You're doing all this collecting data on behavior. And tell us a little bit more about the SPOT program and what you're looking for.
So the premise is that if there's a life-altering event about to occur, that a person's psychology, their behaviors are going to change. And there's a lot of research that supports that, and there's a ton of anecdotal information too about killers and how they behave, in the moments and during the attacks. And so the first step was to understand and train people to understand what's normal, and we call that the baseline behavior. How do people act in this situation? Then the next step was to understand what changes in a person when they're about to commit a violent act. And we're not talking about a reactive, like emotional violent act, because that's a different part of the brain. You know, when someone says something insults you and you want to, you know, punch them in the nose, that's a whole different thing. And we're not talking about reactive violence. We're talking about planned, purposeful violence, where a person maybe over a lifetime has built up this desire to engage in a violent act to address some need. You know, it could be personal need, like I've been humiliated and marginalized my whole life, and I'm going to exact my revenge. It could be something based on a person's culture, religion, ideology. There's always something driving a violent act. And when a person crosses the threshold into rationalizing and accepting this violence, they change. And when they change, they're not, it's paradoxical, but the most violent people are the most calm and detached and robotic in a sense. And that was a big lesson. We're not looking for a crazed person yelling and screaming. We're actually initially looking for someone that's very subdued in a way and almost robotic. I mean, the Israelis have a phrase, the walking dead, because the person has accepted their own death. And now it's just it's a physical act that they have to complete to fulfill what they've already accepted. So understanding how people change when there's planned, purposeful violence was the first step. And then following that, the goal was to train people to pull them out of that calm, focused, kind of robotic behavior by making them feel threatened that they're not going to succeed. And so part of this training was to get screeners and police officers and even people working in restaurants, at airports and train stations, selling tickets, is to let the person know you're watching, maybe even engage in a conversation, because the thing that'll pull them out of their focused kind of military
they're on a mission.
They're on a mission,
So,
and they actually,
sense.
yeah. And when they talk about what they're going to do, they say, well, "I'm a soldier." I mean, that's kind of a common characteristic of people that carry out these attacks. Is I'm a soldier. I'm engaged in a war for a purpose. And so, the training involved making sure every passenger was kind of scrutinized and felt like someone was paying attention to them. Because if I'm on this mission that's life-altering and it means everything to me, and I've prepared years for this, the idea that there's someone paying attention to me is a huge threat. And now I'm going to become that emotional person, and all the behaviors are going to change, and they're going to be actually could be quite extreme. But you have to provoke the person. If no one's watching, they just go right through. And that's what happened on the morning of 9/11. No one was watching. They were looking at an X-ray machine. They were looking in a bag, but they weren't looking at the person.
You talked to me about Timothy McVeigh and how he was on a mission and a little bit about his background.
Yeah.
Share with us a little bit of his story.
Yeah, I mean,
real
here's a
quick.
person that, you know, was probably psychologically normal, although he was bullied. He was raised by his grandfather, and he was called names like Chicken McVeigh. He was a bullied kid. And growing up, he finally, when he left high school, he found something an identity, something to belong to, something that gave him confidence, something that made him felt needed, and that was the Army.
That's right.
And so he went over. He was a decorated soldier in the first Gulf War. Came back. He finally found something in life to be proud of, to give him an identity, to feel good. And so he tried out for Special Forces and flunked out. And so now the bully's the government. You know, I've lived for this. This is my identity, and they've rejected me. And I think in his mind, the government became the enemy. And he did adopt this kind of extreme right-wing ideology, but I think underlying that was this desire for revenge, to get back at the bully again. And so he rationalized and found a purpose in killing hundreds of people, including children. And in his mind, it was righteous. It served a purpose, and the deaths were justified.
And so if you were around him as he was planning this on the day that he actually performed this event, let's talk again about what are the signs? What was it that he was showing that that you study?
He would be, with him, it's almost so obvious because he was a soldier, but he would be on a mission. A lot of people engaged in this don't have a military background, but they adopt the soldier mentality. It was natural to him. And he would be very focused, very calm, even with an explosive, with thousands of pounds of explosives in the back of a pickup truck.
Volatile. So he wouldn't even be showing signs of sweat? because he's thought through this so long.
And he actually, with his training, he would be very calm, focused. It would be almost like you're looking for almost like a sense of detachment with these very violent acts.
Were you able to go back and look at the video footage of the gentleman that came through Boston Logan?
There are
terrorists?
Yeah.
Did you see the signs afterwards?
Well, again, it's unfortunately, I mean, because they weren't provoked. I call it a catalyst. And at critical infrastructure like airports, train stations, the Super Bowl, you want your security officials and everybody else that has some kind of authority to provoke and be a catalyst and let every person feel like they're being observed. Unfortunately, 9/11, there was no catalyst. They weren't provoked. They didn't feel threatened in the mission. So there'd be really nothing to see in a video.
Right, okay. Now, you also took this program and developed a program for the workplace.
Yes.
Being able to identify violence or someone that might be in the workplace ready and able to commit there's signs.
Yeah, there are signs.
Talk to us a little bit about these signs that managers don't pay attention to. And you have a whole program for corporations.
Yes. It relies on the same underlying principles that people that commit these acts, you don't wake up one morning a killer. It usually takes years, maybe a lifetime. And so when you're dealing with workplace, it's like a terrorist attack where this person feels that they have to correct a grave injustice. There has to be retribution. Something has to be fixed. And they're not willing to do it in a constructive, helpful way, maybe admit that they have their own problems, maybe they caused their own problems at work, maybe it is some other person, but it's like a quick solution to a long-standing problem, and violence is seen as the answer. So in their mind, it's justified. They've completely rationalized this. They've planned for it again, months, maybe years. And so, like a terrorist, like a suicide bomber, they're going to exhibit this, the same changes. But with the workplace violence, you have an advantage, because when you're at an airport, you only get to see that person in the minutes before the attack. We at workplaces, we see people. We know them for years in some cases. And so part of this process is getting a baseline for the individual and looking for those changes, particularly changes where a person may become angry, become a little more impulsive, their work performance declines, you're aware of some personal problems. Frequently, like financial problems is a cause for these attacks. There could be illness, family member themselves. There could be some kind of a personal conflict with another employee. Whatever it is, most likely it had been going on for months, and there's going to be a series of steps going into the abyss. And in fact, that's a friend of mine that does this kind of training. I'll give him credit. His name is John Burns, and it's the Center for Aggression Management, and that's his phrase. So. Good phrase, John, going into the abyss.
Right.
And so it's kind of like this spiraling. And so they may start showing up late for work. They may get into arguments with people.
They never did this before.
And they never did this before.
That's the sign, right?
Yeah, the change from baseline.
Right, the change from baseline.
Right. Sometimes those changes are positive, where someone improves at work and they have a better outlook and all that. But we're looking for negative changes from baseline.
Now let's get into your book, Journey from Genesis to Genocide. I have a copy of it with me right here. On how long did it take you to write this book?
I co-authored with Tom Robbins. He was the captain at the time at the airport with me, and eventually became the colonel. And so, based on our joint experience as a kind of a part-time endeavor, we spent about 3 years. We assigned ourselves like chapters. We reviewed each other's work, and over the course of 3 years, we came up with this book. The goal being to take these experiences that we had, like at the airport, and dealing with things like workplace violence and terrorism, and looking at the bigger picture. Basically trying to understand human nature and what is it about human nature that allows rational people, and in many cases, the vast majority of cases, these kind of attacks are carried out by psychologically normal people. What changes and what allows this to occur? So that was the premise of the book.
I was reading in one of the chapters how so many Jews were murdered, shot there, and that the the soldiers, the service members, and the people that had to do this, a lot of them went crazy, you were saying in the book.
Well, they had misgivings, and some didn't. Some just went on with life. Some were really deeply disturbed by it. Some committed suicide. Some just lived with the guilt. Some just rationalized it away. The point being that when these kind of mass killings occur, particularly things like ethnic cleansing and genocide, most of the participants, the people carrying it out, are normal people. That's the scary thing about it. At the very top level, you're usually dealing with, we would call this kind of a person in the book a Machiavellian, but they generally tend to be like narcissistic personalities, devoid of any conscience and just seeking power. But somehow they manage to convince others that this cause is worthwhile, and whatever the cost is, it's worthwhile. And so they're able to enlist supporters who get the message out, and some of it's actually, there may be some type of a crisis going on, there could be a common enemy, but they exploit a crisis or they create a crisis. They identify an outgroup, and we have natural biases against people that aren't like us. So you take that natural bias we have, you label them an enemy, or you dehumanize them. You either create or you take a crisis, create it, or even take one that's real and just kind of exaggerate it to the point where people feel like their existence is in jeopardy, an existential crisis. When you have all these factors, people will adopt doing things that lead to violent acts, but in their minds they're doing it for a purpose that is rational and serves a legitimate purpose.
And I wanted you to explain that, because today people are doing so many things that are violent.
Yes.
And hateful. And they're doing exactly what you said. They create these groups and they convince others that behavior is okay. That behavior is acceptable, and it's completely not acceptable.
The Holocaust, again, didn't happen overnight. It was years of preparation. I mean, you had a population in Europe that was already discriminated against, and there was a large amount of anti-Semitism throughout Europe. So to begin with, you had a marginalized group with people already biased and prejudiced against that group. It didn't take a lot of effort to cast them as an enemy and dehumanize them to the point where their suffering didn't matter. And really, to have a situation like occurred in Nazi Germany in the 30s and 40s, if you can get a majority of the population to at least be indifferent to the suffering and have that core of followers to carry out your mission, you can have another Holocaust. It doesn't take that much.
And that's why I wanted to have you here today, because I see so many things happening
Yes,
that are horrible. Just like this abortion. Now, in some states now, you're allowed to have your abortion at 9 months. How do you feel about that?
No, that's my feeling is, to the extent always possible, life should be respected. And I would say that any destruction of life that's not necessary or absolutely necessary should be, I'm not talking about plants, I'm talking about insects. Any living thing should be respected. And so I understand that the abortion issue is a very complex issue, and there's the Supreme Court case, Roe versus Wade, that actually kind of balances the needs of the mother and this fetus, and at some point one need outweighs the other. So my thing is, as far back in time as you can protect something living, protect it. But I also understand that there may be situations where you can't have that full protection. And that's why, like a decision like Roe versus Wade, I think it's a good decision because it balances interest. It balances the interest in the privacy of the mother with this potential human life, or what some people would think it's a human life.
Many people believe
right.
that it's a human life. It is a human life.
It's an individual, it's a newly created life. And so my feeling is as far back in time as you can go to protect that, the better. But the law has to kind of balance these interests. And so I think if we stick with Roe versus Wade, and that decision basically says that states can protect the fetus in the third trimester. And so that law in New York sounds like it actually conflicts with Roe versus Wade, because you can. But then again, Roe versus Wade puts limits on the government, and if the government doesn't want to put limits on something, it's probably not unconstitutional what they're doing right now, but it could be viewed that way. So very complicated issue, but I just take an underlying belief in just respecting life, and unless it's absolutely necessary to actually harm life, live and let live.
So what have you been busy doing these days, other than at the university?
Consulting. Tom and I actually have a consulting and training business, and we focus on issues like behavior assessments, just general issues of like police organization, maybe police policies, helping departments kind of design themselves or redesign themselves. Just using our experience, combined, we have, I would say, well, close to 80 years of experience between us, and dealing with like big, high-level issues like what happened at Logan Airport after 9/11. So that's the kind of the focus of what we do. We'd like to write another book, and we're just kind of getting started, but we're both very busy, and so like this took 3 years. It'll probably be another 3 years, but we want to kind of write almost like kind of a textbook for like policing, something maybe for colleges, but also for anybody that that's in police management. Like, I mean, what are the best practices? How do you organize? How do you maintain? How do you maintain the highest standards? How do you keep people motivated? How do you respect rights? How do you, just doing it right, and just based on our experience. So that's the next project.
Where can they go to get the book?
So it's on Amazon. I think there's a version that Barnes & Noble has that's like an iBook, and Dorrance Publishing actually is the publisher, so you could go directly to their website and order it. Mm-hmm. And if I know you, I'd give you a free copy, because I've given away more than we've sold. So,
well,
it was not written to make money or to be a bestseller. It was just written out of this desire to let the world know what we learned, and hopefully, make it a better world.
Well, life is important.
Yes.
And that's why I asked you that question.
Yes.
And that's what you're saying here. You're identifying someone that's ready to go take out all these lives, and you studied it, you know what to look for, and that's some great information. So thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you.
And I'll definitely have to have you back.
Love to come back.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.